Hi, Hank. I think by now the internet has made it clear to you that you don't really have any practical knowledge of how knitting works, but that's totally fine because everybody starts as a brand new beginner. I'm sure you, like a lot of other folks, have been scrolling through your TikTok or YouTube or your Instagram and just marveling at all the wondrous things that people can do when they knit. From color to tailoring to design, there's so many cool things that this community can do. And you may be surprised to learn that the community overall is very supportive of each other when we make mistakes. So, in the vein of being supportive, I want to teach you the basics of how to knit. Also, if you're not Hank Green and you're just a true beginner, this would be a great series for you to follow because I'm going to be going over some of the core fundamentals that will help you get started on your fiber journey. My name is Lindsay at Doing the Most Design. I've been knitting for over 20 years. I also have a background in education. I've been taking knitting very seriously in the last 5 or 6 years, and I love to teach people how to knit and how to get better at their skills. So, Hank, what do you say? Let's get learning, okay? Let's first talk about how you might want to select yarn for your very first project. It may not come as a surprise to you that there are different sizes of yarn, and you can Google this later, but we have generally 8 overall categories of yarn, and what we divide those categories up by, we call them weights. And so as the yarn weight gets larger, the yarn gets bulkier. So at the very, very small end of that, we have lace weight yarn and crochet thread. And so this right here is not exactly a yarn, but it is a crochet thread, or what we call 10 count. You can also get yarn that is this size or even smaller, and you do things like lace work with that. Moving up into some thickness, you will then move into fingering weight, baby yarn, or sock yarn. I primarily work in fingering weight yarn. There's not a lot of difference between fingering and sock yarn, other than the fact that with sock yarn, we typically are going to be adding in synthetic fibers such as nylon or acrylic or maybe something else along those lines. The reason for that is because we know for a fact that socks have a lot of contact points and create a lot of friction because that material is rubbing between your foot and a shoe, whether it's the toe or the instep of the shoe or the sole of the shoe. So we add in some synthetic fibers so that the fibers will last longer. If you use pure wool for that kind of material for making socks, then eventually that wool can start to pill up, the fibers can wear down, it becomes what we call threadbare, and then eventually you'll wear a hole into the sock. Now, if you do get into sock knitting, there are ways for you to add some support and reinforcement and places of the socks that you know for a fact that you wear holes down into. But then also we have a complete different technique for darning socks that's super fun as well. And that's one of the cool things about slow fashion is being able to take care of the work that you're creating. So as I mentioned, I primarily work in fingering weight yarn. So when we get to different knitting techniques, I'll be showing you with this ball of yarn in particular. Then we start to move up into further thickness, and you'll run into yarns that are called like sport weight, DK, Aran, and eventually we get up to the tried and true traditional worsted weight yarn. Because you are an absolute beginner, I'm going to recommend that you start with worsted weight yarn. This is what most people start on because it is manageable and thick enough. And so you can see very clearly the stitches that you're using. I have here like a deep crimson. I'm going to recommend for you that you get something that's a lighter color so that you can be sure that your stitches are very visible, because that's going to play a role later in your accuracy when you are learning to knit. Then when we start to move up even higher, you can get into bulky, super bulky, and even jumbo yarn. Now, I don't do jack with jumbo yarn, but I did recently make a hat with a super bulky yarn like this. So you can tell that there is a very wide variety of yarn weights, which means that there is a lot of different stuff that you can do with the material that you're making. So now that you've learned at least a little bit about yarn weights, let's talk about how you would select the needles that go along with that yarn. Now let's talk about what kind of needles that you will be using in order to start your knitting journey. Now, if you've ever watched knitting on TV or movies, you've probably seen something like this where people are using 2 separate sticks and then they're knitting something in between them. These are called straight needles, and this has been probably the most traditional way that people have been knitting since probably the 1940s, I want to say. Don't fact check me on that one. I know you're good at fact checking, Hank. Okay. So point being that this is a very traditional way to knit, although it is not an original way to knit. There also used to be a time when people would use needles that were extremely long and they had a belt, and they would hold one needle inside of the belt and another needle that was very long, and they would just hold one hand here and they would do all the knitting up here. People who did that kind of knitting would make large blankets and comforters and just amazing pieces of work. And it was very laborious, but they were all able to handle it because they had these massive needles and also a tool for themselves that they developed in order to make sure that they had stability in their knitting needles. However, in contemporary knitting, most people that you know today are going to be using some form of a circular needle. So this is a circular knitting needle. As you can see, makes a loop. This is called a fixed circular needle. A lot of folks, especially if you want to really start investing in your own knitting journey and accoutrement, will get something more like this, which is an interchangeable circular needle set, which is what I have. The beauty about an interchangeable set is that you can get a pack that has a lot of different gauges for the needles, and you can change them out and just use the cords over and over and over again. Whereas with this set right here, this is always going to be whatever size needles these are, no matter what I do. So keep that in mind. Now, something that might interest you as a scientist is that this is where the metric system starts to play a role in knitting, although it is common for a lot of American knitters to use two types of terminology when they're talking about the sizes of their needles. Needles are usually measured in millimeters, so that's the metric system right there. But we will also use a different convention in American circles in which we just call it a US size 5, US size 8. And there are a large range of needles that go all the way down to like 000, similarly to what you might think about body modification piercings. So the smaller the gauge, or like needles when you're getting hypodermic needle injections. So the smaller the gauge, the tinier the knitting needle. And then we go all the way up to like 20, 15 or 20 in our numerical values for the US convention. Now I have a little doodad here that came with my interchangeable needle set that shows on one side the US measurements and then the millimeter measurements on the other side. This is a pair of circular knitting needles that I basically was handed down to me from my grandmother, and I cannot for the life of me tell that there are any markings on this to let me know how large this needle set is. So what I can do is come over here and start inserting this until I find a hole that it absolutely matches, and it looks like it's going to be this one right here. So I can tell then that this is a 3.75 millimeter or a US 5. Incidentally, over here, I also have a US 5 3.75 millimeter. And because this is a more modern set, I have it written here on the needle itself. Now, once you are selecting a yarn and a needle to go together, the thing that you really want to focus on is making sure that you find a knitting needle that is about similar size or larger than the yarn that you are using. So I could go a little bit thinner for a knitting needle. That would be appropriate for this fingering weight yarn. And I could even go larger. But of course, the larger you go with the needles, the holier and more open your knitting work will be. So I think it's always best to go with something that is the same size as your yarn or just a little bit larger than that. Because I'm going to be teaching you some basic knitting stitches and techniques, I really want to make sure that you're going to be able to see these stitches, especially since I'm using a smaller weight yarn just for my own comfort. So I'm going with a needle size that's a little larger. It's still appropriate for this size yarn, but it's a little larger because I want you to be able to see the stitches very clearly. Okay, so that's how we are just going to select some needles and yarn. I hope that you've learned a lot, and something that you will learn over time as you develop your knitting skills is that mistakes are inevitable. And eventually, because you're practicing these skills, you'll find that you have the fundamentals to be able to rip it back, make the corrections, and do it right a second time. So Hank, I hope you're excited for the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one. Bye-bye.